in transition to our next presentation. Before we go there, I just want to remind you, if you're looking for TCHs, please stay on after the presentation. We will be, after the question and answer period, we will have a poll question that you'll have to answer in order to get your TCH credits. So with that, I would like to introduce our next presentation. It is entitled No Resilience Without Social Resilience, Highlighting and Expanding on Environmental Justice in the SNEP Climate Leadership Exchange. And Kyle Gray with Throwe Environmental will be making the presentation. Kyle, if you could share your screen, that would be wonderful.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Helen. I will throw that up now. All right, you all can see that okay?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so again, my name is Kyle Gray. I'm a project partner with Throwe Environmental, which I'll introduce in a moment, kind of presenting here on behalf of the SNEP network. And this presentation is titled No Resilience Without Social Resilience, Highlighting and Expanding on Environmental Justice in the SNEP Climate Leadership Exchange. So I'll just start with a quick introduction of who I am, this company that I'm working for, and the network that we're working within. I'll go quickly through this project that we're doing, which was with the town of Wareham, Massachusetts. I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by social resilience, and then I'll go through some key findings and takeaways and kind of lay out what the road looks like moving it forward. So to start off with, again, Kyle Gray, I'm with this company called Throwe Environmental. So we're a small environmental consulting firm based out of Bristol, Rhode Island. And we do a lot of work on environmental finance, specifically as related to climate resilience. And this project that you'll be hearing about today also highlights the work that we do on leadership development and engagement. So Throwe Environmental, the small company that we are, we currently serve as a technical support liaison for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's National Coastal Resilience Fund. So that's a really exciting opportunity that introduces grant funding to coastal communities across the country. But the project that I'm talking about today is completed through our work as a core partner organization within this SNEP network. So SNEP it stands for the Southeast New England Program Network, and it was created in 2016 or 18 rather. It consists of 16 different partner organizations from around New England, working together on issues like stormwater and watershed planning, management, watershed restoration, climate finance, all these different ideas, all tied together with leadership development and climate resiliency. So through the SNEP network, our work is to empower communities through the region to achieve those healthy watersheds and to get sustainability in their financing systems, all through the management of stormwater restoration projects. And I will note that SNEP is funded through EPA Region 1, so all of our services are free of charge to the communities that we're working in. And those communities consist of cities and towns, nonprofit organizations, and tribes within the region. So you'll see this map on screen. That's just a quick overview of the 14 different projects that we have going on from phase 1 and 2 of the SNEP work. They range, you can see the categories that they touch upon in that key. And they range across the community in terms of geographic breadth, but also in terms of the actual content of what we're working on. But the project that I'm talking about is this Wareham Climate Leadership Exchange, right? So this was focused in the community of Wareham, Massachusetts, right at the head of Buzzards Bay before you get onto Cape Cod. The population in Wareham is around 22,000 or so, but it does double in the summer months, right? We can think of all the tourism going to Cape Cod, and Wareham sees that as well, with the population going up to 44,000 in the summer. And they have this kind of economic mindset where they say it's better before the bridges, right? So rather than going to Cape Cod, they encourage tourists and seasonal residents to come to Wareham and to take advantage of the 50 or so miles of coastline that they have, all of the coastal resources, the historic community. And that's really been something that an idea that they're trying to foster recently. But I will note that in recent decades, that's been a little difficult. Historically, the community is a manufacturing center. It was home to the Tremont Nail Factory, which was there until 2006. And then once the factory left town, it kind of left a bit of a hole in the economy in the town of Wareham. So currently the town leadership is working to reimagine that, and they really envision this idea of a community where folks can live, work, and play all in one place. So this really offered an opportunity for the SNEP network to look holistically at this area of Wareham called Wareham Village, and that's the picture you see on the top right. And the idea was to look at this area and think about how Wareham can pursue sustainable redevelopment, all while tying in these ideas related to climate resiliency, right? So how we can think about climate change, sea level rise, green infrastructure, stormwater management, all while we're working to redevelop a community in a sustainable way. So you'll also see in this bottom right photo, we have kind of an overhead map of Wareham Village. And it's a little small, so I'm not sure how well you can see it, but everything's really tight in this community, right? So we've got this river, and right adjacent to that river are the MBTA railroad tracks. Then we've got this area called Merchants Way, which is that key kind of travel artery that they're hoping to redevelop. And they've got another main street that's owned by the town with some parcels on it that have already been redeveloped. So everything's really close. It tends to be pretty flat, and we all know what that means for sea level rise and storm surge. So we had this idea with Wareham to do what we call the climate leadership exchange, right? And it touches on that leadership development component of our work with the town. And it's a peer-to-peer exchange where we were able to bring in leaders from across the country and across the region in on these issues related to Wareham's redevelopment. So we were able to highlight some really key themes related to our project and bring in leaders from across the country that have done work in these areas and foster those conversations between the folks in Wareham and the folks in these communities across the country. So we identified these case studies and we brought them in for webinar sessions that we had. We hoped they would be in person, but COVID taught us otherwise. So they were all virtual. It was a multi-session approach in that we had folks come in a morning session that was a closed conversation between the town and all of the case study communities that we were bringing in. And that closed conversation really gave us the opportunity to have a candid discussion, right? We could hear from those case study communities about what didn't. And we could hear from Wareham about the challenges that they were facing. And so we did that with our second session, which was held in the afternoon. And that was open to the public. We were able to post that session on the website. So if there's any interest in seeing those, they're all publicly available. And then in addition to these webinars, we hosted what we called the Leadership Exchange podcast. So that's where we took our conversations with these case study communities and we edited them down to a nice kind of chunk to listen to. And you can hear about all the lessons learned and the good, the bad, and the ugly from these leaders that we were talking to directly from them, rather than someone kind of retelling what happened in those case studies. So again, those are all publicly available. The link's on screen, but you can also check those out at wherever you get your normal podcasts. So these themes that I kind of alluded to earlier, that we structured this whole exchange around and that we used to, pull out some key topics related to our work with Wareham. They touched on green infrastructure, climate resilience, waterfront redevelopment, and then smart growth and zoning. And, we brought in case studies on each of these themes and worked to do our best to structure that exchange around those. But this idea of climate resilience was kind of the through line through all of those, right? And our team really, after doing our research, we found that climate resilience can and should be kind of split up into three different subcategories or subcomponents. So we've got the economic resilience, right? And we can think of that as, the assets that are economically important to a community. We can think of environmental resilience when we're talking about natural systems and wildlife populations, ecosystems that are vital. And then we've got this idea of social resilience, where we're talking about our societal institutions, the vulnerable populations that we have, and how our everyday lives are affected. And with COVID as an example, we can think about how a kind of holistic catastrophe can come in and really hit us on all three fronts. So our goal with this exchange was to make sure we weren't just thinking about the environmental resilience, right? We talk about climate so much, it's easy to kind of go down that environmental route and maybe think less about the economic issues and even less about the social. This exchange worked to kind of elevate the social components up top and make sure that we were considering them at every point of the way. So with that, we'll switch over to this next section. I just want to kind of briefly go over what we mean by social resilience, and then talk about how, where we saw that in the case study communities we were bringing in. So again, just to underscore this idea of social resilience, we're talking about stronger communities and making sure that everyone has the resources necessary to make their community stronger, right? These investments don't happen on their own. So we need to make sure that they're direct and intentional, and also to make sure that the case is made in terms of how we're communicating this, to let folks know that a social investment is a smart economic investment, right? Social resilience puts the focus on vulnerable and marginalized communities. We know these to most often be Black and Indigenous populations of color, low-income communities, aging immigrant populations, the folks that are often overburdened here. And to that end, we want to make sure that we're including those diverse voices and perspectives, right? But not only doing so in a way that, maybe we say we're including them, but it's not really working in practice. We want that engagement to be genuine, and making sure that not only is the engagement genuine, but that the output is also, right? So the results that, we're kind of getting on the back end of everything are actually meaningful and make that change. And we can think of social resilience very much in the same line as environmental justice, right? There's a lot of similarities here. So when we talk about environmental justice, we're thinking about those determining factors. Very often they're race, class, and status. And we know, what those factors tend to mean for environmental hazards and environmental risks, right? And then environmental justice and social resilience, we'll think about how we can target those direct political and policy links, right? The laws, the maybe indirect policies or legislation that are in place that really maybe centralize those barriers or benefits, or those burdens on folks of marginalized status. Again, social resilience and environmental justice will try to address those systemic problems right at their root, and they work to disperse those benefits and the burdens to make sure that no one's benefiting or facing a burden less than others. And finally, we have this idea of genuine engagement and meaningful results coming through again. So with that, I want to go on to what we saw from this exchange that we had, this event, and talk about what we saw in terms of social resilience and what that means moving forward. So we'll highlight 3 communities here that we had for case studies in our event, and just talk a little bit about what their projects consisted of and kind of the key takeaways from each of those events. So first up is one of my favorite case studies to talk about. This is Lancaster City, Pennsylvania. And you'll see the demographics on screen. But this project that they had here in Lancaster, it was really a holistic green infrastructure approach, right? It was a citywide method of integrating green infrastructure across an entire community. The one example I have on screen here is a porous basketball court. And this really just is one example to show how Lancaster was able to leverage those co-benefits of green infrastructure, right? So this basketball court not only managed the stormwater runoff and took care of some of the water quality problems, but it also had significant impacts on recreation, public health. There were sound benefits in terms of changing the material on the courts from traditional asphalt to porous asphalt. And then we see that a lot of these green infrastructure projects in Lancaster were done in low-income neighborhoods, right? And there was good feedback there. Neighborhoods were asking for more green infrastructure, and they really saw those co-benefits coming out of them. We think of the other co-benefits that they really leveraged in Lancaster, things like walkability and beautification when they were working on integrating green infrastructure across their streetscapes. And then things, ranging from public art to property values to private engagement, right? Getting the private sector kind of involved in this citywide effort. So overall, in this exchange event, we heard that the community should drive the process, right? They should be the ones pushing solutions forward and making sure that the community has a key voice there. We also heard how important it is to leverage those social co-benefits, right? So it can be really difficult for people to conceptualize the need for water quality management, right? Why are we so worried about the rain that's falling from the sky? And maybe the connection between the rain and the pollutants isn't there all the time. but it's a lot easier to understand those recreational benefits or what that means for, the beautification of a city or how that can help public health. And then finally, we heard how important it is to make sure our funding and financing mechanisms are equitable, right? In Lancaster, they implemented a stormwater utility fee, and often that's, politically framed as a rain tax, but we know that's an equitable way to have folks, pay back into a system that keeps, financing in a sustainable way, right? It's a polluter pays model, so it puts the burden of cost on those folks who are polluting. So that was one of our case studies. This next one is New Bedford, Massachusetts, right? So right in the region that we're all talking about here today. And New Bedford, tends to rank very high in terms of social vulnerability. We have a high immigrant population, a significant portion of the population that speaks English as a second language. So social resilience here is really important. And the project that we're highlighting in New Bedford today, there's kind of three prongs to it. The first is that they really work on these workforce development programs where they directly invest into marginalized communities and train them for jobs and employment positions in environmental sectors, right? So kind of tackling this environmental or climate threat at the same time as they're tackling social vulnerability. The second component of this New Bedford project is this citywide plan that they have to tackle resilience called NB Resilient. And there's a lot of different components at play in that, but they really highlight equity, empowerment, and character as three that really rise to the top, and that they integrate in every conversation that they have about resilience. And then finally, they have these resilience hubs that they're working on implementing. And essentially, those just consist of the resources and the support tools that afflicted and vulnerable communities need when a climate crisis hits, right? So making sure that those tools are already there in place for community members when the time comes that they'll need them. So to highlight some of kind of the key takeaways from this event, not only did we hear that the community has to drive the process, but they have to make sure that there's buy-in and ownership too, right? Making sure that the community is actually invested in the projects that are moving forward, and making sure that there's some sense of personal investment and ownership. Again, we hear this idea that we have to elevate vulnerable populations and encourage and engage those diverse voices in a way that actually is meaningful and has some significant result. And then this last case study that I'll touch on today is from East Boston. It is the Harbor Keepers organization. So that's a nonprofit working in East Boston. And we've got some demographics of the city here. But just to highlight some of the Harbor Keepers work, they focus on diverse participation in Climate Ready Boston, right? And that's Boston's citywide planning activity that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. They really work to secure that diverse engagement by making the case for personal action and doing that on a person-by-person level. So they make sure, again, to secure that engagement by making sure folks feel a sense of ownership and making sure that they understand that changes at the city level will have real impact on them and their daily lives. So some key events or key points from this event, we heard that it's really important to build and foster community consensus, right? So making sure all the diverse stakeholders that you're bringing together feel a sense of consensus and that they're all working towards one mutually beneficial solution. And this is especially true with big groups. In another case study that we heard from in Annapolis, Maryland, we heard 100 folks coming together for a stakeholder workshop, and you try to get 100 people to agree on something, it just doesn't usually work, but they were able to do it, and they're making some great strides there. But again, just underscoring this point of reaching consensus. We also heard how important it is to determine and focus on community needs. So this gets at the idea of maybe having a problem statement, making sure that folks agree on what the problem is and what the kind of broad vision for solutions will be to get there. And then finally, making sure that we balance historic character and future vision, right? So we're giving consideration to the past and the culture that has been built up in a community over time, but also making sure that we're taking into account what's coming down the road in terms of climate change and what a community might look like in that context. So that's what we saw in the exchange. I'm just going to spend the next 2 slides kind of talking about what we hope to see in the exchange moving ahead, and then I will wrap up. So we really hope to kind of take the initiative the EPA is pushing on environmental justice further with this exchange, right? So moving forward, we'll have more of these events. They won't be focused on the town of Wareham anymore. That project has wrapped up, but they will be focused on another community to be determined at this point. So we hope in that process to do what Administrator Regan says, in that we want to engage the historically marginalized, overburdened, underserved, and those communities that are living with the legacy of structural racism. In that same vein, that means directly engaging not only the municipal leaders, but community level leaders and organizations throughout a larger community. And in pursuing, environmental justice as a more intentional component of this exchange moving forward, we're hoping for quantity and quality, right? So we want to make sure that we're bringing environmental justice communities in more often, but we also want to make sure that the communities we are bringing in really do a great job of showcasing how environmental justice and social resilience can be tied together for more holistic climate resilience in a community. And we think that means not only bringing in these EJ and social resilience communities as case studies, but making them the main focus of this exchange, right? Making sure that they're kind of what we're looking at over a longer period of time, and we're finding case studies that can maybe help us move that community forward. We're also hoping to continue encouraging and incentivizing that meaningful engagement, right? So that kind of lesson that we kept hearing in every event that we had, we want to make sure that we're taking our own advice and taking the advice that we heard from everyone else, to make sure that we're lifting up community-driven solutions, and that we're not really focusing on top-down solutions. We want to make sure that we're considering and recommending policies that really promote these EJ and social resilience principles on the ground level. And then perhaps most fundamentally to this whole conversation of social resilience and environmental justice, especially as a person who is not of color, it's obviously fundamental to keep asking questions and to keep learning, and to make sure that those diverse voices are the ones leading this conversation. So with that, I will open the floor in just a moment to your thoughts and any of the questions that I saw coming in. I do just want to say thank you again. I'm with Throwe Environmental, and we're working on behalf of this SNEP network. It's a regional group through EPA, and we do a lot of technical assistance with communities across the region. So with that in mind, our call for participants is coming up soon for the fall of 2021. So I definitely encourage anyone, we're looking for all communities, but we're also hoping for a particular focus on EJ. So if there's any interest in learning more there or just having a conversation, definitely feel free to contact me. My email's on screen. It's kyle@throwe-environmental.com. And I know Helen mentioned earlier that it will all be posted as well. So definitely looking forward to hearing some follow-up there. But with that, I will turn it back to you, Helen.
Thank you. Sarah, if you could go through the questions and answers now, and after that, we'll do the poll question for TCHs.
I really enjoyed the presentation. I think you're a great speaker.
Thank you.
So the first question, we have two on the screen right now. The first question is, do you know what types of tools, for example, meetings, interviews, or polls, did the case study communities use in gathering community feedback? Which tools received the most engagement?
Yeah, Catherine, that's a very good question. I would say from all the case studies that we heard about, they probably used a variety. I think more so meetings than interviews and polls, probably polls the least. So right in the order that you wrote on screen. I would say in terms of which tools receive the most feedback or the most engagement, the meetings actually tended to receive quite a bit of engagement, and more so than I would initially think, right? We think about community engagement very often, it can be really difficult. Maybe the municipality itself is having some struggles putting that together. Maybe the community isn't as engaging as much as you'd like them to. But the meetings, I think, really tended to yield quite a bit. I think that kind of honest and, deliberate way of saying, we want to engage folks and we want to hear what you have to say. And we're not giving you, a packet of solutions and saying, okay, authorize this and move forward. It's like, no, we want the solutions to come from the community. That model tended to really work.
Right. Okay. So the second question, what methods do you use for outreach to bring in members of the community?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think we're still pretty old school on that. We have, small company. There's only 4 or 5 of us, but we've got a pretty far reach in terms of a network that we've built up. So in some instances, it was just a lot of emails, doing some digging in terms of research online and making sure that we're finding these communities that we really thought could serve as a model for others, whether it's coming from previous work though, or maybe, communities that we had never thought to engage with before. We found some really great things come out of them. And New Bedford was one. I don't think we had any contacts there before that, but we kind of conducted that outreach on our own in terms of just, doing our own research and following up as needed. And the case study communities really tended to respond well to that. They wanted to showcase the projects that they had. They wanted to help other communities overcome the challenges that they had already overcame. And they were just interested in having a conversation and learning more. So I would just say, pretty typical outreach. Nothing that you might not expect.
I just want to mention to everybody that we will be posting all of these session presentations as well as